Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President and Sue Ann Weinberg, Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical. I would like to begin by thanking Louise Mirrer, our President and CEO, Agnes Shu Tang, Chair of the Board of Trustees, and all of our trustees, in particular, the champions of our library, the late Patricia D. Klingenstein, Sue Ann Weinberg, and Sidney Lapidus. We also acknowledge the generosity of the Mellon Foundation, the Robert David Lion Gardiner Foundation, Helen and the late Robert Appel, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and Carla Knobloch and the family of George Champion. Along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other donors, none of the work of New York Historical is possible without your continued and committed support. The Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical is one of the oldest, most distinguished research libraries in the United States. It holds millions of books, newspapers, maps, manuscripts, prints, photographs, and architectural collections. It is a vital center of research into the history of New York and the nation. Key to that research is the presence of the yearly rotation of scholarly fellows who engage in advancing knowledge as they mine the New York Historical's collections for new ways of interpreting the American past. We are most fortunate to have them in our midst. Tonight's program will give you just a taste of the quality of work that is being done. Liberty Island, New York Women, 1930-2025, will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. The chat function has been disabled, so please do make sure to use the Q&A. After the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. Now then, this evening's presentation will feature the work of Angelica De Vido, 2024-2025 Robert David Lion Gardiner Mellon Foundation Fellow at the New York Historical. Dr. De Vido is a scholar of 20th and 21st century American literature, specializing in women's writing and the history of feminist activism in the United States. She earned a PhD in English from the University of Oxford. Her first book, Girlhood in the Contemporary American Novel, Coming of Age, 1990 to 2020, argues that a radical new version of the coming-of-age narrative has emerged in American novels post-1990 in response to the girl-centric agendas of contemporary feminism. Her work has been featured in American literature and post-45. Moderating this evening's conversation is my colleague, Dr. Anna K. Danziger-Halperin, Director of the Center for Women's History at the New York Historical. Anna received her doctorate from Columbia University, and her research has been published in academic outlets such as Science, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, and featured in popular media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, Time, and Vox. Since joining the Center for Women's History in 2019, she has curated many exhibitions and special installations, including Real Clothes, Real Lives, 200 Years of What Women Wore, currently on view. Welcome, Angelica and Anna.
Thank you so much, Valerie. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you, Angelica, in conversation and hear a little bit more of your research. It's, we share a lot of research interests, and it's always so wonderful to have people in our library going through our amazing archival collections and finding women's history there. And it's just been such a pleasure to have you as a colleague this year, too, while you've been here for your fellowship. So to start off, could you give us a bit of an overview about your projects that you've been working on this year?
Yeah, thank you. So this year I've been working on my new book project, which is titled Liberty Island. And this book examines the history of feminist campaigns to promote women's access to American cities. So cities have always been a vital location for professional, political, and cultural opportunity. But women's access to these opportunities have historically been restricted by exclusionary policies and social practices. And we can think of these ranging from women being actively barred entry to many of the city's professional institutions, to things like inadequate street lighting, preventing women from feeling safe when navigating city spaces at night. So focusing on the time period between the 1930s and the present, this year at the New York Historical, I've been charting how feminist activists have deployed a range of political campaigns to attempt to dismantle these barriers and to promote women's access to urban spaces, institutions, social networks, and communities. And I really see this as being a vital part of the wider drive across the 20th century to promote gender equality. And I'm particularly interested in how these campaigns developed here in New York. So this year, I've been using the collections in the library to explore how New York has functioned as the staging ground for the development of this strand of what I call pro-urban American feminism. And I've been thinking about how these feminist campaigns to promote women's engagement with the city have both directly and indirectly reshaped the spaces, cultures, and communities of New York.
And how did you come to this project, right? It's your book that's just out is around childhood, so it's a little bit of a shift, right?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in how gender influences people's engagement with different spaces. And as a scholar of feminist studies, I'm particularly interested in this through the lens of women's experiences. And I found it in my research that the campaign to promote women's access to American cities, whilst it heavily influenced the development of urban America over the last century, it really remains an overlooked aspect of feminist history. So I want to use the research that I've been conducting this year to illuminate how women's greater access to cities was actually really vital for the achievement of the wider social advancements that feminists campaigned for. And also, while many historians have written fantastic, comprehensive accounts of the American women's movement, I found that none have specifically focused on New York as this geographical epicenter of American feminism. So I wanted to address these oversights by using my research to write a social, urban, and cultural history of how feminist thought and activism has developed here in the city.
And a lot of people don't often think of the New York Historical as like their first stop for archives of women's history, but there is so much here. So can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of materials that you've been working with this year?
Absolutely. And I've been really lucky this year to have had the opportunity to work with such a fantastic range of materials here at the New York Historical. So this year, I've been looking at everything from hotel blueprints to newsreels, posters, photographs, political pamphlets, manuscripts, and so much more. And this evening, I'm going to focus on a range of quite different collections from the library, but which I've selected because in their own way, I think they illuminate some of these really important changes that women's urban lives have undergone over the past 100 years and demonstrate how women's presence and participation in the city has expanded so much during this time frame.
And it's a long time frame, right? It's almost a century that you're looking at. So to sort of start at the beginning, starting with the 1930s, what was happening with New York women's lives during this decade?
So the 30s was a time of really immense change for American women, and none more so than for the women of New York, who saw their professional and social opportunities really rapidly expand during this decade. This is contrary to what people might think of when they think of the 1930s, which is obviously predominantly thought of as an era which is characterized by the economic turmoil of the Great Depression. But the 1930s was actually a time of professional opportunity for women who gained quite unprecedented access to the urban workforce. So, for example, nearly 50% of single women were in employment by the end of the decade. And here in New York, there were 3 million more women employed by 1940 compared to 1930. And the seeds for this increase in wage earning women were sown in 1920 when two very important things happened. So firstly, there's the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. And many historians have charted how this encouraged women to expand their horizons and seek participation in American society beyond the domestic sphere. And secondly, the Women's Bureau was specifically established by the Department of Labor to promote women's access to waged work. So over the next decade, these introduced a range of new outlooks on women's access to the workplace. And while some trailblazing women achieved fantastic careers in law, finance, publishing, politics, and those sort of sectors in the 1930s, the majority of women were finding careers in the so-called white-collar jobs, so clerical jobs principally, in the rapidly expanding American corporate sector during the 30s. And as a result of this increase in white-collar jobs for women in urban offices, American cities really became hubs of opportunity for ambitious, mostly single women who began to move to cities such as New York in their thousands during this time to seek these exciting new professional opportunities. So we can therefore think of New York in the 1930s as embodying these exciting, liberating possibilities that the modern metropolis could hold for American women, as it was absolutely the epicenter of commercial, technological, cultural, and social innovation in the United States during this time. And this idea is really underlined in a newsreel from the era, which is titled White Collar Girls. And this explores how New York maintained a specific attraction for these professionally ambitious women. So as the narrator explains, no city more than New York attracts the talents and the drive of these women. For in New York, some have found outstanding success and reward in positions of prestige and authority. So the reason I start with the 1930s in this project is because this was very much the time when New York became known as the city of ambition for hundreds of thousands of American women. And in fact, women's economic participation rate in New York remained 3% higher than the national average during this time.
Yeah, those are like such staggering kinds of statistics about women entering the workforce in these new ways, in this sort of professional corporate kind of positions. So this impact of all of these women entering these kinds of jobs, it must have changed the city itself, right? How did the phenomenon that you're tracing here change New York?
Absolutely. And both the sort of physical spaces, but also the cultures of New York, which were reshaped so much by women's increasing presence during the 1930s. And there's two collections at the New York Historical that I'm going to focus on particularly, which illustrate how New York was being both physically and culturally transformed. So the first is the Barbizon Hotel, and the second collection is the New York Woman magazine. So I'm going to start off by exploring the library's holdings of the Barbizon Hotel, with which members of the audience may be familiar. So the women who were moving to New York in their thousands during this time needed to find safe, affordable accommodation. But during this time, many landlords wouldn't rent apartments to single women. So property developers actually saw an opportunity here and began to open residential hotels for professional women in the city. And the most famous of these was the Barbizon Club Residence for Women, which opened on the corner of East 63rd Street and Lexington Avenue back in 1928. And as you can see from this really beautiful postcard in the library, which a hotel resident sent to her family in Detroit back in 1936, the Barbizon was an incredibly sophisticated accommodation option for these white-collar women. So for a rent of $12 a week, you could have your own single room, you could have meals in the dining room, a daily housekeeping service, as well as access to the extensive on-site leisure facilities the hotel had. This included a music recital room, a swimming pool, a library, and an absolutely beautiful roof terrace, which had these fantastic panoramic views over Manhattan. So residential hotels had previously been a very popular option for single young men, but in the 1930s, single women very much began to embrace them for their own form of independent living in the city. And this idea of sort of independence that these residential hotels offered to women at the time was highlighted by the motto of another residential hotel on the Upper East Side, which is the Allerton on East 57th Street, whose advertising materials proclaimed an Allerton guest was free to be her own mistress. So as well as providing women with a secure base from which to pursue their ambitions and make new friends with other women in the city, the Barbizon also actually became a hub of opportunity for professional women in its own right. So, for example, it housed the offices of the renowned Catherine Gibbs Secretarial School on the hotel's 16th floor. And it also offered accommodation to the winners of Mademoiselle magazine's famous summer editorial internship. And audience members might be familiar with this because this is an experience that would, of course, go on to be dramatized by Sylvia Plath in her novel, The Bell Jar. And so because of these fantastic facilities and the networks that it offered to women, the Barbizon became an extremely sought-after accommodation option, and it ended up having many famous residents over the years. So this ranged from the unsinkable Molly Brown, as she became known after she survived the Titanic, to people like Grace Kelly, Joan Didion, and Liza Minnelli. So it really was very much one of these iconic New York locations from the era.
Yeah, and so iconic, but missing now, right? Like it's disappeared. So what happened to these hotels?
Yeah, and women's residential hotels are one of these fascinating historical phenomena that I think really tell a wider story about the development that women's lives and the actual city of New York have undergone over the 20th century. So, as women's access to the city expanded over the following decades, women's residential hotels actually closed out of lack of necessity because women became able to rent and actually eventually purchase, of course, apartments on their own, to the extent that now single women actually outnumber single men as homeowners in New York. So that statistic alone really shows this amazing transformation that women have gone in their lives over the last century. So the Barbizon did remain a very popular option for women until the early 1970s, when occupancy rates then began to decline, before almost completely petering out in the 1980s when the hotel decided to allow male guests in order to stay financially afloat. But then in 2005, it was purchased and transformed into the fantastic apartment building, which is named Barbizon 63, which remains the building's current use. So even though it's now fairly transformed in terms of building use and clientele, it's been extremely well preserved by developers. So I'd actually really encourage audience members to go and have a look at this building on 63rd and Lex, because it looks exactly as it would have to the Barbizon's first guest back in 1928. So I think it's a really fantastic site in which to think about the kinds of transformations that buildings in the city undergo, and these multiple histories that so many buildings that we walk past every day in the city actually contain.
It's so amazing when we can see the presence of history, right, in our day-to-day lives. So we talked about these sort of physical changes that occurred in New York as a result of the influx of women, the changing economy. But what kinds of cultural changes happened in the city during the same time that were part of this too?
So this exciting new landscape for American women and the emergence of the sort of urban career girl as a really defining figure of modern New York was perfectly captured by the New York Woman magazine. And this became one of the best-selling publications of the 1930s. So to illustrate this, when the first issue hit the shelves on the 9th of September 1936, it completely sold out within 24 hours, such was its popularity and demand. So the magazine was published weekly on Wednesdays, and as you can see here, it proclaimed to offer its readers the latest in news, ideas, politics, business and professional opportunities, fashion and beauty, the home, movies, theatres, and all forms of entertainment. Everything new that will be of interest to you as a New York woman, expertly presented in pictures and prose. So while this attends to what we might think of as conventionally feminine topics of fashion, dating, beauty, which of course are topics that still very much dominate contemporary women's magazines, the New York Woman's inclusion here of articles on politics, career advice, financial management, really underline how women's lives were actually being reshaped during the 1930s. And rather than, principal concentration on housekeeping and domestic affairs, as women were starting to gain this access to professional institutions and the public spaces of modern cities, the New York Woman really reflects how magazines and American culture more broadly began to offer much more diverse content to women readers, which greater reflected these exciting new realities of their urban lives. And the magazine's also an excellent historical record of the thoughts, aspirations, concerns of New York women during the 1930s. So the magazine had a weekly column called Soundings, Opinion of the New York Woman, which illuminated the content of readers' correspondence with the magazine editors. And this column covered topics ranging from should America join the Second World War to is it proper for single women to drink alcohol at bars in the city? And so it's a fantastic snapshot of the kinds of debates and questions people were having during this era. The magazine also profiled a range of prominent career women in New York, many of whom worked in traditionally male-dominated industries. So these ranged from Judge Justine Weiss-Tulin, who was the first New York woman to hold a judicial post higher than a magistrate, to women working as political advisors in the 1936 presidential election campaign. So an incredibly varied range of careers it profiled. The magazine also ran features on topics relating to life in New York, so including articles on things such as fun activities to do in the city for less than $5, reviews of the latest restaurants, Broadway shows to visit on a Saturday night, as well as advice on latest fashion trends in women's workwear. And you can see here some of the beautiful illustrations that these, particularly the sort of the fashion advice articles had. So collections such as the New York Magazine, I think, really offer a fantastic insight into New York women's aspirations, ideas, concerns, and as well as just their daily lives in the 1930s, and illuminates how these sort of rapid changes that were occurring in American lives during the decade were influencing women here in the city.
And that's such a fantastic collection. I have to make some time to dig into it. It's beautiful illustrations and just such great content. So sort of carrying forward into later into the 20th century, how did activism in the city develop as time marched forward?
So the 60s and 70s were the decades that saw women really adopt greater visibility in the spaces and communities of New York than had ever been seen before. So this ranged from political campaigns out on the city streets to the development of specifically women's spaces in the city, such as feminist bookstores, women's health centres, even women's banks. And feminist activists became particularly visible in the city in the 1970s. So like the suffragettes at the start of the 20th century, the feminists during this decade staged many demonstrations on the city's streets to draw national attention to their campaigns. So as a Newsweek article from September 1970 declared, New York has become the capital of women's liberation and home of many of its leaders. And the fame of such New Yorkers as Gloria Steinem, who's of course a long-term resident of the Upper East Side, really brought the women's movement, but specifically the New York feminist scene, into mainstream American media and culture. And the National Organization for Women, which represented the mainstream feminist movement in the United States, was divided into a series of regional chapters who their objective was to sort of carry out the objectives of the organization at a more local level. And New York was actually home to the organization's largest regional chapters. It was also one of the most active in terms of campaigns, demonstrations, as well as sort of policy victories as well. So now New York, as it became known, represented very much the mainstream feminist voice in the city. But there was also a range of more radical groups, such as the Red Stockings, who became one of the more famous radical movements in the city at the time. But all of these groups, both the mainstream and the more radical strands, campaigned on issues relating to women's access to the city and their experiences of urban space. One of the most famous events from this time was the Women's Strike for Equality, which took place on the 26th of August, 1970. And this was the date that marked the 50th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment of women's suffrage. So this march, to prominent feminists from Betty Friedan to Gloria Steinem called on women across America to go on strike, to demand action on a range of aspects of their lives, where they still faced quite considerable inequalities with men. So this ranged from education and employment opportunities to childcare and women's safety. And so to draw public attention to this campaign, activists in New York organized a march along Fifth Avenue. And this march was captured beautifully in these fantastic photographs by Eugene Gordon. And so while demonstrations for the women's strike took place all across New York, all across the United States, New York's attracted the largest crowd. So there was well over 10,000 women marching together all down Fifth Avenue. And by comparison, this was approximately twice the size of the marches in Chicago and Boston, and 5 times the size of the march in San Francisco. So it's a really huge number of women that completely took over Fifth Avenue. And the women's strike, in fact, still remains one of the largest public demonstrations in the history of New York. And it brought enormous media coverage of the feminist movement to mainstream audiences through photographs like these, and also through the footage on television, which it garnered through news coverage. And after the turnout for these marches, President Nixon pledged a wider role for women in American society. And even though this is a pledge that many feminists might argue has yet to be adequately fulfilled, it does show the power that these feminist demonstrations in the city had at the time in terms of influencing both the local and the national political and legislative agendas.
Yeah, and I love these photos so much. We've returned to them time and time again. And the Center for Women's History, our exhibit in 2020 on women's activism, Women March, used these photos beautifully, and they're still some of my favorite. So it's always wonderful to see them. And so, how does this activism of women in this time period, how did it focus specifically on women in cities?
So women very boldly asserted their rights to the spaces of the city during these demonstrations and campaigns. And one of the most important collections relating to this is the Urban Woman Conference, which took place here in New York in October 1978. So this conference was moderated by Noreen Connell, who was the president of Now New York. And it was designed as a way to hear about women's experiences in the city. So what do women enjoy about city life? What opportunities have they found in New York? But also, what barriers are they encountering in their daily lives? And the conference was structured through workshops and discussion panels on topics ranging from what is life like in New York for women, women in the city of the future, one called Getting Out of Yourself and Into the City, which I love, and isolation in the city and how to make friends, amongst many others. And there was a closing keynote address by Dr. Jo Freeman on the ways in which feminists could use urban policy to improve women's lives. And I think that the conference mission statement really excellently encapsulates its aims. So as it reads, the future of New York City depends on the future of women in the city. The population of New York is 54% female. Urban policymakers are beginning to realize that the future of New York City rests on increased opportunities for women. The Urban Woman Conference wants New York to be a place where people want to live, a city for families as well as single people, a city that will continue to attract career women, a city that will encourage the career growth of the women who already live here, a city that will once more be flourishing and exciting. New York needs to support its women. Who will save New York? Women will. And this statement really underlines the connection that feminists made between increasing women's opportunities in American cities and the economic and social benefits that not only women would experience, but that the city and a nation as a whole would see. So in November 1978, following this conference, Now New York published a free guide to urban life for women, which was called the Urban Woman Resource Guide. So this 48-page booklet was divided into advice on 17 categories, which Now New York believed represented the central aspects of women's lives in the city based on their 10 years of experience that they'd had advocating for the women of New York about the issues affecting their lives. And so these topics ranged from childcare and employment to women's community groups and housing. So the introduction to this guide reads, Dear Urban Woman, this resource guide is for you, the subway rider, the executive, the struggling artist, the secretary, the pipe welder, the theatre goer, the homemaker, the ever hopeful Mets fan, the recently divorced. And this guide is also a product of all the women in New York City. At the Now New York office, we get over 300 calls a day from women. Your calls always give us a feeling of what changes are taking place in the city. The New York chapter of the National Organization for Women has played an important role in these changes. We will continue to do so only with your help. The ultimate problem of sexism in our society and in our city is women working together for women. Join us. So this guide was distributed to 10,000 women in New York. And I think that this introduction really underlines Now New York's attempts to encapsulate the diversity of women's lives in the city in this guide, as well as the range of issues they encountered, and the complexities of what women actually wanted from their lives in the city. So in addition to offering advice, this guide also advertised a range of stores, services, and community groups for women in the city. These ranged from New York handy women to do jobs in your home, to the Women's School on Madison Avenue, which offered classes on career advancement and business and finance for women, as well as women's bookstores in the city. So one of the reasons why I particularly love this archival collection is because it not only offers a fantastic insight into the issues that were shaping women's lives in New York in the 70s, but I think it's just a fantastic way of highlighting the kinds of stores, services, communities that women were engaging with at the time. And I think because of that, it just offers such a fantastic snapshot, very much in a similar way to how the New York Woman magazine showed us what was shaping women's lives in the 1930s. I think that the Urban Woman Resource Guide really underlines what women's lives were like in the 70s.
Yeah, and I want to follow up on something you just said in a moment, but first I want to give a reminder to our audience that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A feature, and we'll get to them as soon as we are turned to that. I have a few more questions for Angelica first. And based on what you just said, can you tell me a little bit more about those bookstores? What role did women's bookstores play in the city?
So women's bookstores were a really vital location for connecting women in the city, as well as for promoting the ideas of feminism. So they were places where women could just go to relax and browse the shelves. They also became very vital places of refuge and consciousness raising for women. So a great example of this is Woman Books, which opened here on the Upper West Side, not very far away from the New York Historical, on West 92nd Street back in 1975. And Woman Books stocked around 6,000 fiction and non-fiction books, all of which were written by women. And it was a key place in promoting women's literature at a time when feminist studies was beginning to enter American universities and mainstream publishing. And historians have actually widely credited women's bookstores as helping feminist studies and women's history to grow as academic disciplines, as well as for promoting feminist ideas to mainstream audiences. So, as well as promoting women's writing, women's bookstores were also really vital places of information for women in New York. A lot of them contained community boards, which offered pamphlets and adverts on topics ranging from career workshops, community groups, to childcare, apartment listings, and so on. So, women's bookstores were another one of the physical manifestations of women's claim to a place in the city. And New York feminists, in fact, campaigned that there should have been a women's bookstore in every neighborhood of the city. Unfortunately, didn't quite achieve this aim, but the 1970s and 1980s saw an enormous expansion of these stores across all 5 boroughs of the city. Sadly, like many independent bookstores, in the 1990s, many of these places did struggle to stay afloat with the rise of online booksellers and the steep increase in rents in the city. So Blue Stockings bookstore on the Lower East Side is one of the only remaining stores from that era. But one of what I think is the really positive developments in the city over the last decade is that we are starting to see an increase once again in independent bookstores supporting particular communities. And some of these stores, audience members may well have visited themselves. So 2 examples are You and Me Books down in Chinatown, which specializes in Asian American literature, and Café con Libros in Brooklyn, which focuses on intersectional feminist literature. So I think hopefully in the near future, these are a sign that we'll see a real renaissance in this diversity of independent bookstores in the city. But it's really great to see that they're starting to not only reappear, but also flourish.
Yeah, and since this sort of heyday or increased activity of feminist activism in the 1970s, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that women have faced in New York since then?
So women have made enormous advances over the last century. So whereas the collections of the 1930s that we started with demonstrate how the majority of women could only really aspire for jobs as clerical workers, and women struggled to find independent living options for themselves in New York. Women can now seemingly pursue any career of their choosing. And as I said earlier, single women now outnumber single men as homeowners in the city. But a range of challenges do remain. So two aspects of women's urban lives where progress has been far more stilted is women's feelings of safety in the city and women's experiences of sexism and harassment. And there's two collections at the New York Historical that illustrate this. So I'll start by looking at the Wall Street Oral History Archive, which is a wonderful collection of interviews with influential figures on Wall Street in the second half of the 20th century. So Wall Street remained almost completely closed off to women until late in the 20th century. A few trailblazing women were able to get roles as researchers and clerical staff in the 60s and 70s, but it wasn't until the 1980s when women began to pursue careers as traders during the Wall Street boom of that decade. And 5 women are interviewed as part of the New York Historical's Wall Street Oral History Archive. And while their stories are incredibly aspirational, as women who rose up the ranks to become senior traders, who were paid very enviable annual salaries, these women are also very frank in describing some of the forms of discrimination they encountered in the workplace. So this ranged from sexist hazing of new recruits and a daily barrage of belittling and sexist comments from colleagues to having to travel all the way down to the basement because there were no women's bathrooms on the trading floor, and of course discovering that they were being paid a lot less than male colleagues. So while this archive demonstrates the enormous gains women have made in terms of access to some of the highest paying professions in the United States, it also emphasizes how the cultures of some workplaces haven't necessarily improved at the same pace as these advances in women's workplace rights. And instead, many women continue to encounter discriminatory behavior and unequal pay in the city. And now New York did actually stage a number of demonstrations outside the stock exchange on Wall Street to try to bring attention to some of the sexism that women had encountered there. So, for example, one of the campaigns was about, even though women did, in the 80s, when women had gained employment as traders, many of the bars and private dinner clubs that the male traders frequented wouldn't permit access to women. So this was one of the many areas that now New York attempted to draw attention to. So sexism and discrimination when it comes to pay and treatment in the workplace remains definitely a challenge for women in New York. Another challenge is safety. So crimes against women in New York have reduced, but women's feelings of safety in the city haven't necessarily improved that much. And this was an aspect of city life that now New York was particularly focused on campaigning against. So, for instance, one of their more recent campaigns was in June 2000, they organised a Take Back Central Park demonstration after more than 50 women were attacked in the park on a single day in a spate of assaults on the 11th of June 2000. And police in the park were also quite unresponsive to women's reports of these assaults. So, as campaigners explained, the purpose of this march is to send a loud and clear message. This is our city, and we will not be intimidated into silence or seclusion. We have the right to walk these streets without fear of violence and harassment. We have the right to proper protection from the New York Police Department. And now New York, as part of these demonstrations, demanded a full investigation and an apology from the police commissioner for the women who were ignored when they reported these crimes. 2 groups of men were eventually brought to trial and charged relating to this crime, but campaigners argued that this incident really demonstrated the fear of random attack that many women still live with on a daily basis in the city. And particularly they were concerned about this lack of response from law enforcement when women do report these incidents. So Mayor Bloomberg attempted to tackle this back in 2006 when his office ran the New York Loves Women campaign, which aimed very much to make New York the safest city in the world for women. So, however, many feminists were not overly impressed with the mechanisms for achieving this, because as they explained, these political pledges needed to be matched by major funding for more shelters and crisis centres for women in the city, as well as for improving things like women's safety on public transport. And these are topics with which I'm sure the audience will be familiar, because they've, again, become big debates in the city in the last few years. So these collections underline how women have made enormous gains in the city over the last 100 years, but really demonstrate how there is still a lot more work needed in order for women to achieve full parity with men in terms of being able to really enjoy all of the opportunities that the city offers without feeling hindered by their gender in any way. But I'd like to end on an optimistic note, though. And one of the things that has been really noticeable over the last few years has been social media accounts and online and print guides to the city for women have really started booming over the last few years. These have ranged from maps of walks in the city to learn women's history, to information about women's sports clubs, book clubs, and blogs about fun activities to do in the city, either on your own or with your friends. So I'd like to end by highlighting these, because I think that these show that the drive for women to be part of the fabric of New York is not only still strong, but it's really growing ever more. So I'd like to leave these as the final note to think on that.
Yeah, no, and that is a really hopeful sort of trends that we can see. We do have a lot of questions in the chat and only a few more minutes, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. The first one is a very specific question and maybe a recommendation for you as well as other audience members. But did you come across the book Empresses of Seventh Avenue by Nancy McDonnell in your research?
I did, and I in fact went to the book launch of that. That was one of the first events I went to when I moved to New York at the start of this fellowship. And that is a fantastic historical oversight of particularly how the fashion industry was so influential in allowing women to access these amazing career trajectories in the city. So absolutely, I would definitely recommend that book to people who are interested, particularly in professional women's experiences in the city in the fashion industry. It's a fantastic book.
Another question. Have you noticed an evolution of the word girl in reference to adult women? And do you have any thoughts about it? For a period of time not long ago, the use of the term was sort of discouraged or suppressed, particularly, but not exclusively in reference to adult females. But it seems to have come back in common use. If you have any thoughts.
Absolutely. And this was something that I also thought about with my first book project, which looked specifically at American girlhood. My thoughts on the reason why girl has become a very popular term for adult women is because people have been very much reclaiming the name girl as a sign of sort of joy for women, and something that in that regard perhaps defies age boundaries more. So I see it as becoming, whereas previously we would have thought about it as denoting particular age categories, I think that one of the common usages of girl to describe adult women in the contemporary era is to think about the ways in which those sort of joyful elements of girlhood can defy different age boundaries.
Yeah, interesting.
I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts about that, because I think everyone has a different interpretation of why that has become a big phenomenon.
Yeah, it's one of those terms I think that historians love, because it seems like it should have a really literal definition, and then the usage shifts so much with context and time. It's one of those really fun things to be able to trace. And yeah. So another question, was there a push to move women back to the home in the 1950s in New York City, just as there was nationally?
So the propaganda campaigns with which I'm sure many people are familiar with of the 1950s were very much nationwide during that time. So the women of New York would have been very much seeing the same kind of advertising materials in magazines promoting the sort of Mrs. Homemaker ideal in the same way that women in rural states would have. But one of the interesting slight misconceptions about the 1950s, particularly if we think about it in terms of women's access to waged work, the 1950s actually saw an incredibly high increase in the amount of women who were working outside of the home. So New York, similarly to the 1930s, the economic participation rate of women in New York during the 1950s was higher than the national average during the 1950s as well. But I think that one of the, so whilst New York was still very much a hub of opportunity for women who wanted to pursue ambitions in the workplace during the 50s, I think that one of the interesting things I found with my research is that some of those ideas we have about the 50s as a decade where women were being encouraged to very much leave the city, to embrace the suburbs as a community, they often, some of the statistics from that time do tell a bit of a different story. So I would encourage audience members to have a look at some of those economic participation rate statistics, because they do tell quite an interesting story of women's lives in the 50s as well.
I'm seeing it we're at time, but I think we can squeeze one more question in because this is I was just talking about historians love defining terms, and I think that this is kind of another question about, which women are we talking about here? So the question is, can you talk more about working class and lower income women? It seems like this is almost a discussion more of middle class women, and working women like nurses' aide, home cleaners, restaurant workers, and factory workers are also working in the city at this point.
Absolutely. And so my focus on what we might think of as the more sort of middle class jobs, my focus on those in relation to the barber zone was because they were very much the kinds of professions that women who stayed at that hotel were working in. But absolutely, women from different backgrounds were also working in an incredible range of careers, both before the 1930s, but also well beyond that. One of the things that was interesting, though, about clerical workers, which became the largest category of women's work from the 1930s, and in fact still remains the largest single category, is that actually, whilst it does have a reputation as being a sort of middle-class women's occupation, here in New York, it was much more diverse than that. So there were women from all sorts of different communities in the city and people who had recently moved to the city who were finding these new jobs in the rapidly expanding American offices that were opening up during this time. So whilst I focus very much on more middle-class women in terms of occupancy of some of these residential hotels, the actual workplace itself was quite diverse in terms of socioeconomic background during the 1930s. And that's one of the interesting phenomena in terms of the clerical work in particular. It was actually a more diverse sector than many people think during that time.
Interesting. It's really, I always love, in all of our work, we're always thinking like, okay, which women are we talking about here? And how are we grouping them? So that's great. We could go on all night, and I feel like every time, Angelica, you and I talk, we end up talking for much longer than we intended every time we have coffee. But we have unfortunately run out of time for this evening. Thank you so much for being with us here today, to you, Angelica, and also to the audience. And please sign up for our mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on upcoming fellows talks like this one. The New York Historical is currently open Tuesday through Sunday. You can reserve your timed entry museum tickets on our website, and we hope to see you on Central Park West to view our exhibition, Real Clothes, Real Lives, 200 Years of What Women Wore, as well as our upcoming exhibition, Blacklisted, An American Story, which opens on June 13th, in addition to our numerous other offerings. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.